Good afternoon, and thank you so much for staying right here on LCM channel, and a very warm welcome to today's edition of the Truth Setters Show. Your host, my name is Danny L, and of course looking forward to a wonderful interaction here on Truth Setters. Remember, Truth Setters is an educational show here on LCM channel where we just endeavor to delve into matters of the truth, to establish what really is truth and how does truth relate to our day-to-day lives. Because remember, when you look around today in the world today, there's so much deception, there's so many so-called gray areas. You may really not know what is right, what is wrong, what is true, what is false. And here on Truth Setters, we're here to just shine the light on what really is truth. So we're here to establish what the truth is. And we hope that by the end of this episode, or by the end of any interaction that you have with Truth Setters, you will begin to think at a higher level. You'll begin to ask some deeper questions. You'll begin to have some brighter answers to the questions that you have, especially around life. What life is, what the purpose of life is, what our history is, what our destiny is, and everything else. And of course, today, our topic on Truth Setters is around history and destiny. We're trying to establish what the truth is around history and destiny. Because remember, when you look at your life, it is like a continuum of your past, your present, as well as the future. So we're trying to establish with regards to what our past has got to do with where we are today and what we can do in our present to ensure that we bring about the future that we're looking for. And of course, today on the show, we're privileged to have as our guest on our discussion, Chanock Ben Israel, who is the leader of the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem here in Zambia. Chanock, welcome to Truth Setters.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to be back here again.
Indeed, we had a very fruitful discussion last week, and we hope that we could build up on that and get to the next level of that.
Absolutely, looking forward to it.
Indeed, and just in case some people may be seeing you for the first time who may not have been privy to the show we had last week, may you just briefly introduce yourself and of course the community that you hail from.
Okay, well, first of all, allow me to give all honor, thanks and praises to the Holy One of Israel, to the God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and to his anointed servant in this dispensation, Ben Ami, Ben Israel. My name is Brother Chanock Ben Israel. I am a Zambian, but I'm also an African Hebrew Israelite. I am the national representative of the African Hebrew Israelite community here in Zambia. We are a jurisdiction that is part of a bigger body or community of African Hebrew Israelites who are located or who are situated in Israel, in the city of Dimona, which is in the southern part of Israel, in Judea. And we are a group of people, African people, who have traced their biblical or their ancestral lineages back to the descendants of the ancient biblical Israelites.
Okay.
And I think that during the course of today's discussion, we might delve a bit deeper into what that really means. Because obviously, naturally, people will be asking themselves to say, but you're African and you're black. What does that have to do with?
Because the Hebrews we see and the Israelites we see are of European descent.
The image that has been consistent has been that of European descent of Hebrews, which of course they are European Jews, but there's also Jews of other colors.
Okay, interesting. So of course that's an interesting intro, and we look forward to delving deeper into all those matters. But for now, we'll go on a short break. On the other side, catch us with more interaction on Truth Setters. All right, welcome back, and thank you so much for staying with us right here on LCM channel. This is Truth Setters, your number one show for all matters truth, and in terms of just establishing what the truth is about a particular thing. And today we're talking about all things to do with history and destiny, and what is the truth about our history, and what destiny are we chattering for ourselves. And of course, thank you so much for the love that we're seeing on the Facebook stream. We are seeing some love from David Bashidi Ngandu. He's saying, keep up the good work, Yohai. Thank you so much, Bashidi Ngandu, for coming through and sharing that love. And of course, keep all your comments, all your questions coming through. If you've got anything that you would know better than we do, if you've got any question that you have, please put it on the comment and we'll be able to engage in that particular discourse. And of course, today in the studio, I'm engaging with Chanock Ben Israel from the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, and we're talking about all matters truth, and of course, particularly around history and destiny. So before we went on a break, Chanock, we were talking about the work that you do at the community, as well as how the community finds its roots from the biblical Israelites, but of course, being African, and as well as the connection to that root of being Hebrew and being Israelite. So now, recently we did celebrate Africa Freedom Day. So we'd just like to delve a little bit into that particular area to say, Africa Freedom Day. We're saying it's been 60 years since we signed the charter of the African Union Organization, and we're celebrating our freedom because we don't have colonialism on the continent anymore. So from your view of things and from your understanding of things, Africa and freedom, what comment would you make in that regard?
Thank you. It's a very excellent question. I think maybe it's one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves today. And before I even delve deeper into maybe addressing your question, I would like to use this time to speak to the elders, those who came before us and who sacrificed them for their literally life and limb so that we could be here today and we could be in this space and being able to experience what the hope that they had fought for, fighting for African liberation. But the struggle still remains. The struggle is not over, and the liberation struggle, is not yet finished. 60 years after signing of the Charter of the African Freedom Day, African freedom and liberation from quote unquote colonialism, we still find that Africa is doing poorly in every metric. Economically, we're doing poorly. Socially, we're doing poorly. African families, African communities, and you find that on every metric, we have to begin to ask ourselves, what is the cause of our problems? Why is Africa still lagging behind in any major area of importance and significance concerning both the continent, the nation states, and the people at large? So I feel that perhaps we have not fully addressed the depth of the damage that colonialism has done to the African mind and to the African psyche. And the only way we would find out exactly what the true extent of the damage is if we reevaluate or reassess our history as Africans. So history plays a critical role in us understanding whether or not we've progressed from the time we struggled or we've only gone further backwards.
When you talk about our history as Africans, the first thing I think about is the history I was taught in the classroom, because I was brought up, around the 90s into the 2000s, and the curriculum in that day was mostly around colonialism. So we were taught that before we were Zambians, first we were Northern Rhodesians, and that entailed when the Europeans actually came and, took over our land. So now, in terms of our history, how far could we extend our history beyond colonialism? Because I think that's the only history of Africa. And in fact, beyond colonialism, the only image I have is we were jumping around trees. We were monkeys in Africa, because that's the image I've been taught, especially from my experience. If there's anyone with a different, understanding, they could put it out there. But that's the experience I've had, and I think that's what you would relate to also. So beyond colonialism, how far back could we draw our history? Because we understand that where we're coming from is so much important as to where we're going also.
Right. Well, that's this is the most shocking thing. In your opening, you alluded to the idea of the world being under the influence of deception. Now, deception is not just to tell a lie. Deception is to tell a lie so convincingly well, such that even if the truth were told to you, you would deny it or you would resist it. It would be hard to believe. So to deceive is to make the lie appear as the truth, and the truth appears as the lie.
Yes.
And Africa, and the way that Africans, black people in general, world over, in the way that we have been educated has been very deceptive concerning our history. As you've said, I can relate to what you're saying, because that's the same type of education I received in the conventional,
the school
systems. But Africa's history extends far beyond colonialism and European conquests of the continent.
Yes.
Africa was the very source of the beginning. Africa's history goes as far back as biblical history. And now the reason why there's a discrepancy, or rather there is a blackout between what were we before we became Northern Rhodesians and Southern Rhodesians and Bechuanalands and South Africa as the modern South Africa states. We came from somewhere. And
yes.
Like I said, a people that do not know their history are like a tree without knowledge. And a tree without knowledge is dead. And those are words that are taken straight from the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who was the father, who's arguably considered the father of the Pan-Africanist movement. And when you consider that a people with no knowledge of their history are a dead people, it stands to reason why history becomes more significant even today in order to understand. Because if you don't know where you're coming from, you have no idea where you are, and most importantly, you have no idea where you are going. So therefore, you relinquish your destiny into the hands of others to determine who you are and where you must go. And this is the crux of the problem we find here in Africa. Africans are not in control of our own destiny. Our destiny is being decided and designed by others who don't even live amongst us. They are the ones who tell us where to go and who to meet and who to shake hands with and who not to shake hands with. As a matter of fact, if we look at the geopolitical situation right now with the current crisis in the Ukraine, the Western societies are dictating to Africa the terms of their relationship with other nation states. We recently saw America issuing statements towards the South African government for them giving a lenient treatment of Russia. But isn't South Africa a sovereign state?
It is.
Shouldn't they have the right to determine who their friends are and who their enemies are? Or who it is that they should get along with and who it is they shouldn't get along with? But the fact that that statement can be made goes to show who really feels that they are in control and have been in control in the last 500 years. So history becomes a key element, and not just random history of knowing old historical events, but understanding the role that history plays in a people's destiny. So Africa at large is a continent with no significant idea of who they are, where they came from, and who their God was. So maybe how could we create this African historical timeline now to be able to put these things in proper context and perspective? Because, of course, I've got this view from the classroom about Africa being impoverished, Africa being, being a land of struggle and all those things. But again, we hear of places like, Mali and the library at Timbuktu. We've got the pyramids of Egypt. These are amazing African feats that have been achieved on the African continent. So how do we begin to now piece it together and then now begin to find the truth about our lineage in terms of our history as an African continent and how that feeds into our present and our hopes for the future? Excellent. If I may borrow the words of one of the inspired prophets of Israel, Jeremiah, which when he stated to say, "Seek ye the old paths, for in them ye shall find rest for your souls. For in them ye shall find your way back, and you shall find rest for your souls."
Maybe just a bit of a side note. Why so much insistence on the Bible? Because people will say the Bible is just a religious book. So why so much insistence on the Bible, and what keys does it have for our lives?
Because the Bible is a text of African history. The Bible is not a religious book. When we study the Bible today, we view it from a religious or a secular context, in the sense that we view it with the biases of what we have been taught religiously. But religion and the Bible are not the same thing. You see, a religion are a set of traditions and activities that have been superimposed by men for their own advantages. As a matter of fact, in our community, we view religion as part of the problem. Religion was designed to do only one thing, to keep division in the midst of men. And when we consider the current state of affairs of the planet, we see that it has worked thoroughly well. But if we put religion to the side and consider on the basis of truth, view the Bible from the basis of a historical context, we begin to see, particularly the Old Testament Bible, we begin to see the pieces that you mentioned of the timeline begin to put together. The ancient Israelites were an African civilization. They were a people of color, if we have to be politically correct. But if we have to be truthful, they were an African people. They were a black civilization. So were the ancient Egyptians. So were the ancient Ethiopians, the ancient Libyans, the ancient Canaanites. So as we begin to see that if we go back even to the first book of the Bible, in the Genesis, in the creation story, Africa is present.
All right. Now, before we get to the presence of Africa in the Bible, so what are some of these things that we could point to, to substantiate our claim that actually the biblical Israelites, the ancient Egyptians and all these historical figures that are prominent in our history today were actually of an African origin?
There's plenty of history that has, been written, that has been captured. There is anthropological evidence, there is archaeological evidence, and of course, beyond just the cultural, the anthropological, and the historical references that we could, begin to look into to verify this, there is also the spiritual component, because Africans are a deeply spiritual people. And that means to say that Africans and black people in essence, they have a unique or peculiar relationship with their creator. The challenge or the problem has been that for a long season, they have had no exposure to the thought that could reintroduce them back to their original idea of God. I have in my, in front of me, an article that was published by a very famous magazine. The front cover of it, if I may be able to show our viewers, this is from a Newsweek magazine. And this Newsweek magazine, and this was in 1988, and the front cover of it says, "The Search for Adam and Eve. Scientists explore a controversial theory about man's origins." Now, what is most intriguing about this front cover magazine is that the people that are depicted as being representative of the first people in the Genesis are not the typical ones that we've been accustomed to since childhood.
Yes, it looks like some African, because that looks like an African man and that looks like an African woman.
Absolutely. Now, this was in 1988 when. Now, this is a well-published magazine, well-reputed.
I think I've heard about it also,
Right.
Newsweek from the United States.
Right. Now, they were saying back in the 80s to say that we need to rethink the creation or the Genesis idea or depiction of who Adam and Eve were. And they're depicting a black man and a black woman as being the original idea of Adam and Eve. But if we go back into your Bibles, you will find, for example, in the book of Genesis, that the Garden of Eden, the beginning of the four rivers that encompass that garden, they were all rivers that could be found here in Africa. Right.
Is there a scripture that we could actually quote right now? Because I think people could have Bibles wherever they are, so maybe they could do their own verification.
Absolutely. If they could go to Genesis, chapter 2, and then they can say from the 10th to the 14th verses.
Okay.
And they will find that there the instructions, or rather the information, states to say that there were four rivers that watered the Garden of Eden. And again, Eden means a paradise. And those four rivers, they were divided into two rivers each. And the first one being the Pishon and the rivers of Pishon and the Gihon. And they passed through the land of Ethiopia. Now, depending on what version of the Bible that they may be, because there's different versions out there, but either it will say Ethiopia or it will say Cush. If it says Cush, Cush is Hebrew. It's a Hebrew word, and it means black.
Okay.
And it was what they translated as Ethiopia in the KJV. And of course, Ethiopia is a Greek word as well that means that would mean sunburnt, or people who have been burnt by the sun. Because when the ancient Greeks first encountered the people of dark-skinned race, they referred to them as sunburnt. And so that was a general reference to people who were of a darker complexion as being referred to as sunburnt. And so we find that Ethiopia, the land of Ethiopia, is found where? On what continent?
It's on the continent of Africa.
In the northeast of Africa.
All right.
And you will find that what rivers are in that region of the northeast? That is the white and the blue Nile. And those two rivers make together the Nile, which becomes the longest river. And the Tigris and the Euphrates are the others that are found further north in northeast Africa, or in the areas today referred to as Iran, Iraq, etc. So we find that entire stretch from as far as the Nile Valley region all the way to Lebanon, that entire region was referred to as the garden where the the place where the region where the garden was planted and where the first men and women were created in the image and likeness of the Creator. And so when you look, it says in the scripture says that the Lord planted a garden eastward in Eden. So the garden's name was not Eden. The garden was planted in the east of Eden. If I plant a garden in the east of Matero, does the name of the garden change to Matero?
No.
It only means that it's giving me a direction as to where to find the garden. So Matero has an east. That means that logically Matero has to have a west, has to have a south and a north. So if Eden had an east, then Eden had to have a west. And if Eden had to have a west, it had to have a north and a south. Now, if we can use those geographical parameters provided by the Bible to say that Ethiopia is one of those regions, or that region, Northeast Africa, is the east of Eden, then where would the west of Eden be? Westward Eden would be West Africa. Northward Eden would be North Africa. Southward Eden would be Southern Africa. And it makes absolute sense. Why? Because Africa is the richest continent on earth. The word Eden itself in Hebrew, Eden, it means pleasure, beauty, and paradise. Surpassing pleasure. So you will find that Africa is endowed with virtually the core wealth of this world. And Africa's wealth has been used to industrialize and develop other nations. And they continue to mine and till and pillage this particular continent. So we will find why this original name of this land, in the biblical sense, this land that we call Africa today, its original name was Eden. So you and I, we are here in Zambia, which we could say is in the south central of Eden. That alone. Now, again, this crosses with circular history, which says that the earliest traces of human beings were found in East Africa, right? Kenya, in the Nile Valley region, Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, where they found the earliest bones. Well, is that a coincidence as well?
No.
And we say that the African man and the African woman is the mother and father of modern human beings. Again, this is verifiable with, this can be verified using, scientific data that has been used to publish the fact that from the very beginning, black people and Africans have been involved in the writing of the Bible. This was an article from the Washington Post, right? Again, 1996. So while we were celebrating Christmas and New Year, European intellectuals were revising all of that which they had been teaching us in Sunday school. Because now it says that the genetic DNA evidence points to an African origins of all humans. All humans today are descended from an African mother and an African father. So Adam and Eve most definitely were of an African origin themselves.
All right. Amazing stuff right there. And of course, we're still getting up close and personal and interactive right here on Truth Setters with Chanock Ben Israel, who is the African Hebrew Israelites jurisdiction head here in Zambia. And of course, thank you so much for the love that we're seeing on Facebook. We're seeing so many comments and people just coming through and being engaging on the show. Of course, thank you so much, Tamara, for coming through and saying thumbs up, LCM. Thank you so much for the love. And of course, shout out to Given Malilwe. Thank you so much for staying tuned and locked on to the show today. And of course, invite all your friends to come through and let's get interactive and get to establish the truth. Today we're talking about history and destiny. And today Chanock is telling us that actually Africa has got its roots in the Bible, because honestly for me, when I was reading the Bible initially, I used to look at the biblical account as a very distant account. I used to think that this actually happened at a different time and in a different place. It never even occurred to me that it actually happened on the African continent. And we did quote that from the book of Genesis when you read the second chapter. And I bet you could have a Bible in your phone or even at home. So if you read the second chapter of the Genesis, especially from KJV, King James Version, you find that there's a land Cush mentioned there, and Cush is actually the earlier name for the land of Ethiopia. So really amazing. So now I'm just curious to know that when we get into this knowledge, this understanding of our link as the African land into the Bible, what kind of mind frame do we get into? What kind of exposure does that kind of knowledge bring to us and help us to build for our current and even for our future?
Well, it brings us beyond just identity, because of course naturally people would have an emotional refreshment having to hear some of these things to say, the ancient people in the Bible were of African descent. That's emotionally refreshing. But we have to move beyond just identity. We also need to get into the idea of applying redemptive knowledge. Now, what do I mean by redemptive knowledge? Redemptive knowledge is knowledge that is applicable, that will help to alleviate some of the problems that a society may face. But the measure of the success must be tied to our ability to align our achievements, our success, with our source, who is our maker. That is the difference between a secular struggle and a redemptive struggle. A secular struggle does not consider the position of God in any of the affairs. Africans, as I said, are a deeply spiritual people. But have we ever considered to ask ourselves, why are we so spiritual? I mean, here in Zambia, literally every weekend there's almost a new church or a new mosque or a new temple opening up for people searching for God. But look at the state of affairs of our communities. Look at the state of affairs of our neighborhoods. Our children are in the streets. Our mothers are being brutalized. Our fathers are running with hopelessness. What has happened? What has happened to the African man, to the African woman, to the African family order? And how have we allowed ourselves to become such a degenerate society, patterning ourselves after people who have no God consciousness? So we have to return the idea of God consciousness back into our African psyche. To develop is not enough. We must begin to develop in the right direction.
Amazing, amazing. I like that you brought about the concept of God and the idea of God, because I think that's something that most people have an understanding of, and most people get to gravitate towards a God, a maker, someone that they worship and they revere. And today in the world, it's almost like there's a God for everything. There's a God everywhere, And then I'm now asking to say, if there's so much awareness about this creator God, and everyone says, God knows, God bless, and all these things, I owe my life to God and all these things. If there's this consciousness about God and this godliness, how come we still see so much of this struggle? And then how can people find their way back to the God you're referring to, the God of the creation? Because if there's so many gods, I think there's got to be this God of the creation that holds the destiny of the world, that people should find their way back to. So how do we reconcile that? So much religiosity, so much calling on the name of God, God knows and all these things, but there's still so much strife and so much suffering. So now how do we find our way back to the truth about who this God is?
Again, I'll borrow the words of one of our Hebrew prophets, Yeshua, known as Jesus. By their fruits, we will have to know by the fruits, by the fruit that it bears. If, like I said, with 60 years post-independence, and if we are not eating or enjoying the fruits of freedom, then clearly whatever we had planted, or whatever seeds we had planted in the 60s, we were given the wrong seeds. We have to begin to look at our condition as a harvest. A good tree cannot produce forth corrupt fruit, and a corrupt tree cannot produce good fruit. Now that may sound like a religious sentiment, but it really is not. That's an Edenic science. That is a higher idea or ideal. It's truth. You see, if we were given the solutions to freedom, we would not be struggling today with debt. We would not be struggling today with feeding our families and keeping up. But perhaps the solutions we were given were solutions that were putting others at an advantage over us. Have we tried to apply African solutions to Africa's problems? I mean, people say that all the time, but really, we have not, because we are afraid. One of the first areas of applying an African solution to an African problem is the problem with African religiosity, because that is a problem. How do we fix African religiosity? As you said, there's over 20,000 religions on this earth. That means that there's over 20,000 gods telling you what to do. That does not make any sense. And for the Africans, he doesn't even have a chance to try all of them out in one lifetime. So we have to begin to address the God area. And how do we address that? By decolonizing the idea of God in the minds of African people. You see, the image that we were shown of the Son of God and God being European, that was purposeful. And it was purposeful what? To subjugate spiritually, to colonize spiritually the African psyche. Because once the Son of God became white, everything that was white became of God's nature. So Europeans became the children of God. Even when they erred, it must be because God wants them to do so. And so everything that came out of Europe, we Africans would accept it and acknowledge it as being godly. To challenge any European idea would be as if synonymous to what? Challenging God. That was the psychological implement that was played. Because if I may to ask you, prior to the 15th and 16th century, prior to the coming of European missionaries, what were Africans' ideas of God? They had a God. Did they see God as a European savior? Did they expect a European savior God? No, they had their own idea. But when the missionaries came into Africa, the first things that they set up were what? Educational institutions.
Okay.
And what were the purpose of these educational institutions? Their fundamental purpose was not to teach you how to read, write, and calculate your arithmetics. But it was to what? To unlearn Africans of their own history. To unlearn them of their African consciousness. To rid them of their own perceptions about God. And now, here we are, like I said, we were, for 400 plus years, we were given a European idea of the Son of God. Well, again, I brought some, you asked for some proof. Well, this is their own words. This is their own writing. This is, again, another newspaper, highly published, highly recognized. It's American
US
magazine.
News. Yes.
United States News.
I think it's 1993, actually, December 20th.
Right. And what were they asking?
Who was Jesus? A new look at his words and deeds.
Who is Jesus? A new look at his words and his deeds. But I thought they knew this all this time.
Okay.
So who is the Jesus they were teaching us if they're starting to question that themselves, to say who was Jesus? Because if I put up this image in any black church anywhere in the world,
we're going to start to bow.
They will recognize this as being the Son of God. This is the image that they will be anticipating for their salvation. And this is why even today, Africa has failed to move forward, because we are waiting for salvation to come from Europe. And that waiting process was part of the deception to keep Africans in line and not to take charge of their own destiny. Because when Africa rises, it has to be the fall of other civilizations. And so to prevent our rise, they had to maintain an idea of God in our minds that would keep us subjugated as perpetual servants or in a perpetual state of servitude. This is why Zambia may be endowed with all kinds of precious minerals, but we are always, since independence, having to go around with a begging bowl. And this is not to attack any political party or any people's political inclinations. Beyond that, we have to begin to have mature conversations beyond political ideas. What are African lawyers today and African judges doing in today in the so-called free era, draping themselves in garments? We see the garments, the powdered wigs, the British powdered wigs, which are vestiges of a colonial era. Could we not design something more African to represent our legal officials? So all of that is an idea. The suit and tie, and pardon, no attack to you, brother, but the suit and tie, that's an idea. If I went into an African parliament dressed in my culture as an African, I would be viewed as being informally dressed. But if I went in with a suit and tie, I'll be viewed as being formally dressed. Who is defining what is formal and what is informal? So we need to be, again, all of this is tied back to what? Spirituality. Our spirituality was colonized. And so what we are trying to do as the African Hebrew Israelites, is to begin the process of decolonizing the Bible and also redeeming the minds of our people to begin to take charge of their own destiny.
Amazing, because when you mentioned colonialism, I think the only thing that was colonialized was the land, But now that you mentioned that even the Bible and even our own spirituality was colonialized, it's amazing, because it means it went beyond just the fight for the land or the fight for control, but actually that there was all these things happening. So I'm now interested to find out, what are some of the things we could do, as we get to wrap up this particular edition of this discussion? What are some of the things we could start to do, to find these answers, to decolonize this idea that we were taught about, our history, about the Bible, and even about God itself, like you had mentioned?
Well, first, one of the first things what we could begin to do is some of the most obvious things, such as if any of our brothers and sisters out there, if you have this image on your bedroom wall or in your office, please begin to remove it. Do not put this to the next generation of African children. We need to begin to allow ourselves to learn our true history. We have to go back and revisit a lot of the things. And this is not an easy process. We understand that it's a very painful change, especially change towards the right things is a very painful position, because it has to do with you having to unlearn some of the things that you loved. People have to begin to unlearning their love for Christmas, because for all intents and purposes, that's a pagan holiday. That has nothing to do. What white man or fat white man is running around on the 25th of December giving people gifts in Africa, all over the world? All that was what? Part of traditions that we inherited that did not come from us, But maybe it is those kinds of traditions that are continuously putting us in a perpetual disadvantage when it comes to the interests of our sales. So one of the first things that Africans could start doing is considering, who are you and who is your God? Begin by asking that question, and the rest will be unfolded.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. So much engagement we've had here with Chanock Ben Israel from the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, the Zambian jurisdiction here. And of course, so many time bombs, I could say that you've dropped, so many things that I didn't even expect to even get to delve on today's particular edition of Truth Setters. But I hope that wherever you are, it's giving you something to think about and to be able to ask some questions and find the answers for your purpose. Because remember, we only have this life to live. And I hope that even as you're living this life, you get to find that purpose and find the truth to live by. So this is where we get to wrap up today's show. But before we go, Chanock, we are speaking about history and destiny. So what will be some of your takeaway remarks with regards to how as Africa we could take a hold of our destiny and get to do things right going forward?
One of the things that our spiritual leader Ben-Ami would often say is to say that where a people are is relative to who is leading them. Okay. And where a people choose to go is relative to who will be leading them. So if we are here at this particular juncture where the condition that we see Africa in, struggling with wars, struggling with all kinds of difficulties, it is simply because our leaders have led us in the wrong direction. The next couple of years will be a very important time for Africans to begin to choose for themselves what direction we must go. And the only way we can do that is if we reassess our history. History determines destiny. If you do not know where you're coming from, you certainly do not know where you are, and you most definitely do not know where you are going. So I will close that to say that it is time now for us to allow ourselves to be taught once again anew from truth, from a center of truth, not bias of anything concerning race, ethnicity, or tribe, but rather based simply on truth literacy. Africa needs truth literacy.
Of course, and this is the Institute of Truth. Thank you so much, Chanock, for coming through.
Thank you so much.
Indeed, and of course, thank you so much to you, our viewers, for staying tuned to Truth Setters right here on LCM channel. Remember, we come through to your screens every Monday around this time to just get to delve into all these matters around our truth, to find the truth about our lives and find the truth about what we are, where we are, and where we need to be. So until next time, my name is Danny L. Stay tuned to LCM channel and stay blessed.